Hey, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the second episode of my mini musical show called The Andy Dare Show. I'm your host, Andy Dare, and today we are going to be bringing you the top 5 favorite albums of the 80s according to the namesake of the show, Andy Dare. All right, to get into it, also you can follow me at Andy Dare, that's ANDYDERER. Find me on Facebook and all that goodness, and you can always give me your top fives. Yeah, the night before the show, I will always be putting a message out asking for your lists because I will be reading them on the show, and I just like to, talk about music with people. So it's very interesting when you can just put something out there and have people write back to you. It's interesting. So we got a lot to talk about this episode. As always, you can find me on the Fleecast, and this episode, as well as every episode, will be sponsored in part by the Fleecast. It's a comedy-centric music podcast located in the West Loop of Chicago, and it features me, Ryan Trembath, and Drew Trilla, as well as producer Adam Burnett. And we do a weekly show, a lot of funny jokes going on over there, a lot of great guests. This week we actually had a great opportunity to have Giovanni Giorgio, a.k.a. Adam Carolla's superfan and archivist. And we had him in the studio. Actually, we did a nice, I think, hour-plus show. Talked about a whole bunch of stuff, run the gamut from talk about Scientology to music talk to what's big on TV now. And then we closed it off by talking a little bit about his podcast, the GIO podcast, the Get It On podcast, a.k.a. And that show is really interesting. Check it out if you're at all a fan of Adam Carolla, because Giovanni has single-handedly found a whole bunch of the old Loveline tapes from ranging back from 10, 15 years ago, from when Adam Carolla started in 95 with him. And he's cut them up into thematic episodes and made it really user-friendly for anybody who wants to get back into those episodes and obviously can't find it on iTunes or any of the new stuff like that. So it's a great podcast. Check it out at giopodcast.com. All right, let's get into it. So we are covering the top 5 favorite albums of the 80s, according to Andy. And I got my number 5 right now. It's a little Irish band called U2 with the Joshua Tree. Came out in 1987 on Island Records. And this is really when U2 definitely exploded into an arena act all across the world. Had a really magnificent production job, in part with Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois, who actually worked with Neil Young on his latest record. Definitely very interesting, large scope sounding record, meant to be played in big places, not small little clubs. Very powerful song arrangements, even though it might be a little too large reaching as far as trying to become the most important band in the world. They definitely succeeded in creating a nice balance of real catchy songs that sound important with groundbreaking production of its time. Definitely didn't sound like a lot of the pop records that were coming out in 1987. It came out on its own with its own sound, with its own large-scale epicness, and it still rings true to today with bands like Arcade Fire. Without the Joshua Tree, they would definitely still sound like independent bands. But now a lot of bands are really trying to go for the big scope, trying to go for the large venues. And this is definitely one of those albums that struck a chord with a lot of people all around the world, trying to make political changes and stuff like that. I know it's not very important to me right now as far as being political in rock bands, but at that point, it sounded like we needed it, like the world needed it. So that was very important at the time. And with excellent sounding guitar from obviously The Edge, a legend, who his sustained notes really just catapulted them and really fit well with the stadium sound. So they had connected with their audience, hit it out the park for this one. And by the time they came back in the early 90s with their next record, Achtung Baby, they would be already starting to experiment with club sounds, with dance beats, stuff like that, and would slowly get away from their, epic arena rock sound that they captured on the Joshua Tree. I think it had something like 5 hit singles, Videos back when videos meant something, with YouTube playing out on the roof of one of the buildings with people just watching in the streets. With or Without Me, a huge hit. And I think Eno definitely had a big hand in creating these, not too synthy, but definitely experimental sounds mixed with these pop ballads and pop songs that they had written. But yeah, so my number 5 is U2, The Joshua Tree. Go check it out if you haven't, or if you probably weren't even born when it came out. Next I got my number 4, little band called the Talking Heads with Remain in Light. This came all the way back in the beginning of the decade, 1980. And once again, featured production work by Brian Eno. He would obviously have a huge hand in creating justifiable pop music in the 80s and really critically successful, real deep-reaching, epically produced albums. Remain in Light is definitely one of those. And the Talking Heads prior to this were more of a club band, kind of a hipster act, a precursor to new wave, you could even say. But with this, they started, I think it was the album before, Fear of Music, is when they started with becoming more a little bit multi-rhythm, becoming more experimental with their beats and use of percussion. And when Remain in Light came out, it sounded like no band that had become before it, or it sounded like no other Talking Heads record. David Byrne he must have been listening to a lot of African music before this, because they definitely didn't sound like they were from New York anymore. You know, they were a completely different entity than when they had started when it was just about 4 years before this. So they had come not full circle, but a 180 from the band that had started. Talking Heads Remain in Light is my number 4. Features one of their biggest hits, if not the biggest hit, of Once in a Lifetime. And the sound that they created on this 1980 album would definitely be used and used and used again throughout the decade of the 80s, and would make them legends in their own time. Too bad that the band would only last for another 10 years and then call it quits, slowly becoming more pop as the years went on towards the 80s and a little bit less experimental. But Remain in Light is when they had everything right, and Talking Heads Remain in Light is my number 4 album. Well, if you haven't been by the website lately, the website is theandydarershow.podbean.com. So go check it out. Got a lot of videos. Obviously have all the podcast episodes, or the first 2 that I will have up. I got a video of me working at Uncle Bub's Barbecue in Westmont, talking about the family business there. I've also got a video of one of my first bands, Pencap Chew, playing a show in 1996 in Clarendon Hills at the Lions Park Pool with an introduction by a radio legend, Dick Biondi. I've also just put up a video that's in part with the Fleecast. It's Bryce McDonough calling in and leaving a voicemail to the Fleecast. I don't want to say anything more about it, just that it is a very mysterious phone call and that you should check it out. The guy is a 22-year-old Bobcat sales rep who sings sad country waltzes on a Saturday night behind chicken wire. So please do check these out. Stop by the website. If you don't have iTunes, obviously you can come by the website and just stream the episodes. The website is, once again, theandydarershow.podbean.com. And thanks again for listening. And obviously you can follow me on Twitter at Andy Dare, ANDYDERER. And also check me out on Facebook. We'll have exclusive content on all these websites, so it helps just to keep in touch with me. So my number 3 release. We are up to number 3 with the 5 favorite albums of the 1980s, according to myself. Number 3 is Prince with the soundtrack to Purple Rain. Came out in 1984. Prince really captured the essence of the 80s in one album with Purple Rain. Also creating a movie and the soundtrack to go along with it. It was no mere soundtrack, though. It was probably his tightest, most compact album that he has ever released. And I think it had 9 songs and then it had 6 hit singles. So that ratio is pretty high. That batting average is pretty high, obviously. And it's with him, his band The Revolution, a real self-recorded sound, but however, these were pop songs meant to play to the whole nation, the whole world, and really struck a chord with the 80s, with the MTV generation. Yeah, I've seen the movie lately, and it doesn't really hold up 1/10 as well as the album does. The album sounds like it's something that they will be listening to 50 years from now. The movie, I don't know as much. The movie has a lot of scenes where it's just very melancholy, emotional, just looking at himself in the mirror and having like a sad look upon his face. However, the music is vibrant and energetic and catches many different styles of black music, or not only black music, but of just rock, of all sorts of different Euro sounds that he was experimenting with in 1984. And I think it's his tightest, most concise album that he's released in his storied 30 years. And I think he's probably had about 50 or 60 albums, so that's saying something. So number 3, we had Prince, Purple Rain. Go check it out. I wouldn't check out the movie. I would just stick with the soundtrack. It's got 9 classics on it. Go check it out. Brings us to our number 2 album of the 1980s, the Reagan era, the Chicago Bears Super Bowl era. All right, I got number 2 is Guns N' Roses with Appetite for Destruction, 1987, on Geffen Records. What can you say about Appetite for Destruction? I think it is probably the best hard rock album ever released. Song for song, pound for pound, this is the strongest hard rock album. I think it totally demolishes Back in Black by AC/DC. Has more range than that, has more emotions, yet it is just as hard or just as strong sounding as any of the hard rock records that had come before it. And as far as stuff in the 90s, it's a little bit more dangerous than stuff in the 90s. A little bit less PC, a little bit less, college friendly. This was definitely raw, angry, energetic, hard rock. Not quite metal, more hard rock for the leather crowd, or just for, bar music, kind of just loud and destructive. Yet this as well had about 4 or 5 hit singles. It catapulted Slash to superstardom with his guitar style, and made Axl Rose a household name to people. Even though they would not get along to release 2 more albums, they only would release 1 more as a group. 1991's Use Your Illusion. Appetite for Destruction found them at the crossroads of becoming the biggest hard rock band in the 80s, and the most important too. Axl Rose's rock star-like behavior would be completely suitable for this set of music that he released. And obviously, being such a hard-to-deal-with rock star, they could only catch lightning in a bottle for so long. This would obviously not last so long, as much as 4 or 5 years, until band members would start leaving, start complaining, people would get arrested, people would start getting locked up, and the band would be no more after 1993. Until they came back years and years later. But that doesn't count. This is the original Guns N' Roses 1987 sound, Appetite for Destruction. Check out Sweet Child of Mine if you haven't. If you haven't heard that, then you really haven't heard rock music. So that was my number 2 selection, Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction. All right, I got to give a shout-out once more to my podcast and the sponsor of the Andy Dare Show, the Fleecast. Basically a comedy-centric music podcast taped weekly, not in front of a live audience, in front of ourselves in our practice space at the Music Garage, Chicago. We've had many storied guests. Already in Season 3, we've only had 4 episodes, but we've already been able to get a music legend, a recording legend, Steve Albini. He's worked with the Stooges, worked with Nirvana, has his own bands, Big Black and Shellac, and Rape Man, and owns his own studio, Electrical Audio, downtown, and invited us over there, and we got to pick his brain for over an hour, and that episode is up. That is episode 301 of the Fleetcast. And I was just telling you, last week we got the chance to interview Adam Carolla superfan and archivist Giovanni Giorgio. We had him actually at the Music Garage, and we totally discussed everything about the Ace Broadcasting Network, everything that's going on in his life. Definitely check out that interview. That is 304. And where you can find all this is the Fleetcast official website is thefleetcast.podbean.com. You can follow them at Fleetcast, Fleacast, and you can like them on their Facebook as well. That's facebook.com/Fleetcast. So this brings me to my number one album of the 1980s, according to Andy Durr. Obviously, there's only one album that you can really think of about the 80s. Man just passed away last year or a year and a half ago. It is Michael Jackson with Thriller, 1982. Thriller is the album of the 80s, hands down. No one can argue it, unless you're some, DIY punk guy who never listened to pop music. You have to give it props. Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson created a masterpiece, a 9-song opus that would capture everyone's imagination, capture everyone's emotions at the same time, make something that's bigger than a genre, bigger than rock, bigger than pop or R&B, a song, an important song that will be sung and listened to for, I'd say, hundreds and hundreds of years from now. It'll be passed on from generation to generation, and it won't be looked at as a pop album, won't be looked at as a rock or a soul album or an R&B album, dance album. No, it'll be listened to just as an album, as a time capsule back to 1982, back when MTV was everything, back when club music was really taking over, back when people still respected new wave music, people still respected going in between genres and borrowing from different sources and coming up with something timeless. Thriller is by far his best album, as well as the whole decade of the 1980s. Quincy Jones's production style would never hit the apex that it hit on this magical album that will forever be listened to by generations and generations. Once again, I think it's definitely something of the 80s is that it didn't have a lot of tracks, only, I think, 9 songs on there, yet most of them are hits and most of them are classics. So there was always a high slugging percentage with these albums, not a lot of filler, not a lot of space between all the hits. So that's why you really got to check out all 5 of these records. I mean, kids, I think that a lot of young kids, junior high school kids these days don't really respect these old albums. They just respect what's big on Facebook right now, what the kids are listening to. I mean, MTV doesn't even play videos anymore, so I'm not quite sure how they get to find the new music. Hopefully it's something like Pitchfork.com, which is how I've been introduced to many new bands that are coming up that are more my age, that are still young bands but are on the cutting edge. You can check them out at Pitchfork.com. I also check out a lot of stuff on AllMusic.com that gives reviews, and it's been going on for a long time. So they have books released. They have a whole bunch of thousands and thousands of record reviews and great suggestions as far as if you like this album, then you might like that. And that's what I hopefully want to turn this show into, just a way to spread the news about certain bands, spread the news about old music, try to get new generations into older music, and try to get older generations into new music. So it's going to go both ways, cross-pollinate that way. So my number one selection, obviously, Michael Jackson, Thriller. Go get it. Don't be talking about how the 80s was full of bad music, because I think it was just as great as any other decade. Just as many hits came out in the 80s as any other decade. Sure, there was a lot of bad groups, but you don't have to remember the bad groups. You can go back and just pick what you want to remember about the 80s, and these are my 5 albums. Number 5, U2, The Joshua Tree. Number 4, Talking Heads, Remain in Light. 3, Prince, Purple Rain. 2, Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction. And number 1, Michael Jackson with Thriller. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this little mini episode. This is the Andy Dare Show. Check us out every week. I'm going to try to be posting them every Saturday. The Andy Dare Show is sponsored in part by the Fleetcast. Go check them out if you haven't already. And, you can always follow me on Twitter at Andy Dare, ANDYDERER. Find me on Facebook. Check us out. Look at all the YouTube videos. Come by the website. We always enjoy talking to people that have listened. And until next time, this is Andy Dare, thanking you so much for listening.